a millionaire visits one of his restaurants and sees the cook being humiliated by the manager. What he did next left everyone speechless. The steam rising from the pots formed a dense mist in the kitchen of the magnificent palace, one of the most prestigious restaurants in São Paulo. Helena Damasceno, 45, adjusted the flame under the shrimp bobo pot, while quickly consulting her time-worn recipe notebook. The yellowed pages held much more than culinary instructions. They were vivid memories of her childhood on the Bahia coast, where she had learned the secrets of cooking from her grandmother, Josefa. "Always stir in the same direction, my dear." She could almost hear her grandmother's voice whispering in her memory. "The secret isn't only in the ingredients, it's in the love you put into every gesture." Helena smiled, feeling the familiar aroma of palm oil mingling with fresh shrimp and freshly chopped cilantro. That Friday night, the kitchen was buzzing. Orders kept arriving, and the team moved in a synchronized dance of chopping, seasoning, and finalizing dishes. Helena oversaw every detail, ensuring that every plate leaving her kitchen was impeccable. After 25 years dedicated to the culinary arts, her name had become synonymous with excellence in that establishment. "Helena!" The harsh voice of manager Robert Mendez cut through the air like a sharp knife. "What is this nonsense about? Wasting fresh shrimp? Do you have any idea what these ingredients cost?" He was holding a tray containing what looked like shrimp leftovers, his face flushed with anger. The entire kitchen fell silent. The assistants exchanged nervous glances, while Helena maintained her composure even as her heart raced. "Robert, those are the shrimp I set aside for the stock. It's part of the traditional recipe, you know." "That traditional recipe?" Robert interrupted disdainfully. "This isn't some backyard kitchen. This is a high-end restaurant. If you can't adapt, maybe it's time to look for another job." What no one present knew was that hidden near the kitchen door, Anthony Vasconcelos, the new owner of the hotel chain that had recently acquired the magnificent palace, was watching the scene with interest. He had decided to pay a surprise visit that night, curious to understand how his latest acquisition operated. Helena took a deep breath, swallowing the lump forming in her throat. With precise and dignified gestures, she continued her work, though her eyes were brimming. The aroma emanating from her pot began to spread through the kitchen, a fragrance that made anyone close their eyes and instantly feel transported to a sunny beach in Bahia. Anthony closed his eyes, letting that aroma carry him away. In his 30 years in the hospitality business, he had rarely encountered a scent so inviting, so authentic. He observed how, even after the public humiliation, Helena maintained a professional demeanor, guiding her team with gentle words and precise movements. As the night progressed, praise for Helena's dishes kept pouring in. "The best bobo I've ever tasted," customers declared. "There's something different, something special." Even Robert, albeit reluctantly, could not deny the dish's success, though he continued shooting disapproving looks at the cook. In a quieter moment, Helena allowed herself a few minutes of rest. She sat on a small stool in a corner of the kitchen and opened her recipe notebook. The pages held far more than culinary instructions. They were stories of her family, of her people, of her homeland. Each recipe had its own narrative, a special significance. Her fingers gently caressed an old photograph in which her grandmother Josefa smiled, surrounded by children in the seaside kitchen of her home. "One day," she whispered to herself, "one day I'll have my own restaurant. A place where these stories can be told through flavors, where every dish pays tribute to our culture." What Helena did not know was that her whisper had been heard. Still discreetly observing, Anthony Vasconcelos smiled. He recognized in her something that no culinary school could teach, a genuine passion for cooking and a deep connection with her roots. The night ended like so many others. Helena cleaning her workstation, carefully tucking her recipe notebook into her worn bag, and preparing to face another day of hard work. Yet, something was about to change in her life. Fate, like her finest recipes, was merely waiting for the right moment to reveal all its flavors. The next morning, Helena arrived earlier than usual at the magnificent palace. It was her daily ritual to calmly prepare the ingredients, check the supplies, and plan the mise en place before the day's hustle began. The sun had barely risen when she walked through the back doors of the restaurant, carrying her inseparable bag with the cherished recipe notebook. To her surprise, she wasn't alone. Seated at one of the kitchen tables was Anthony Vasconcelos, waiting with a cup of coffee in hand. Helena recognized him immediately from magazine articles, the billionaire entrepreneur who had bought the hotel chain a few weeks ago. "Good morning, Ms. Helena Damasceno," he said, with a serene smile. "I hope you don't mind my early visit. I'd like to talk about something important." Helena's heart began to race. Had Robert lodged a complaint? After all these years, was she about to lose her job? "Good morning, Mr. Vasconcelos," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Last night I witnessed something extraordinary in this kitchen," he began, gesturing for her to sit. "I saw a professional who, even in the face of unjust criticism, maintained her dignity and continued producing exceptional dishes. But more than that, I sensed something that I haven't found in the culinary world for a long time: authenticity." Helena relaxed a little, yet remained alert. "Anthony," continued, "that shrimp bobo, it had something special, something you can't learn in culinary schools." "It's my grandmother's recipe," Helena answered with a timid smile. "She always said every dish needs to tell a story." Anthony leaned forward, intrigued. "And what story does that dish tell?" Helena hesitated for a moment, but something in the businessman's gaze encouraged her. She opened her recipe notebook and began to speak about her childhood in Bahia, about the days spent in the kitchen with her grandmother Josefa, about how each recipe carried not just ingredients, but memories, traditions, and love. "Let me be frank, Miss Helena," Anthony interjected gently. "I'm planning a new project, a restaurant school that will be unlike anything on the market. I don't want just another place teaching French techniques or modern trends. I want a space that preserves and celebrates our traditional cuisine, that tells our stories through flavors." Helena's heart raced again, this time for a different reason. Anthony continued, "I'd like to offer you an opportunity. Over the next 6 months, you will undergo intensive training in management and administration, while we develop the concept for the restaurant school together. If all goes well, you will be the executive chef and project director." The world seemed to spin around Helena. It was as if all her dreams were about to come true at once, but insecurity soon reared its head. "Mr. Vasconcelos, I don't have formal culinary training. I've never attended a cooking school. And that's exactly why you're perfect for this project," he replied firmly. "We want someone who understands that true Brazilian cuisine wasn't born in schools, but in our grandmother's kitchens, in our family stories." At that moment, Helena's cell phone vibrated. It was a message from her daughter, Julia. "Mom, I need to tell you something important. Can we have lunch together today?" Helena glanced at the message and then at Anthony, feeling the weight of responsibilities on her shoulders. How would she balance all this? A new project, her family, her dreams. "Think it over," Anthony said as he stood. "I know it's an important decision. Tomorrow at the same time, I'd like to hear your answer." He walked toward the door but paused before leaving. "Oh, and Ms. Helena, about that comment on wasting shrimp. The stock you make with them is fundamental to the recipe. Never let anyone question your expertise." Alone in the kitchen, Helena reopened her recipe notebook, running her fingers over the yellowed pages. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. In life, as in cooking, sometimes you need the courage to try new flavors. She looked out the window, watching the sun fully rise over São Paulo, and felt that she was about to begin the most important chapter of her life. The small restaurant in the Paradise neighborhood was nearly empty when Helena met her daughter Julia for lunch. The 28-year-old university professor was already seated at a table in the back, nervously fidgeting with her water glass. Helena immediately recognized that gesture. It was the same one she used when she was anxious. "Mom!" Julia leaped up for a tight embrace, and Helena noticed something different in her eyes, a mix of joy and apprehension that intrigued her. "Are you all right, my dear?" Helena asked as she sat down. Her mind was still reeling from the conversation with Anthony Vasconcelos, but Julia's expression brought her fully into the present moment. "Mom, Julia took a deep breath, her eyes welling up. "I'm pregnant." For an instant, the world seemed to stop. Helena felt a wave of emotions surging through her. Joy, surprise, worry. She was about to become a grandmother. She reached out, taking her daughter's trembling hands. "But there's more," Julia continued in an almost whisper. "The doctors, they said it's a high-risk pregnancy. I'll need complete rest for the next few months. And you know Peter is always traveling for work." Helena's heart clenched. Peter, her son-in-law, was a commercial pilot who spent more time in the skies than on solid ground. "My dear, you are not alone. I'm here for you." The words came out automatically, but soon the weight of reality hit her. How could she juggle caring for her daughter and the professional challenge that had just arisen? The training with Anthony Vasconcelos would require her full dedication. "Is something else bothering you too, Mom?" Julia asked, noticing the shadow that passed over Helena's face. Helena hesitated for a moment, then decided to share. She told her about Anthony's proposal, about the restaurant school, about the opportunity to finally realize her dream. As she spoke, she saw Julia's eyes light up with pride. "Mom, you can't turn this down," Julia exclaimed. "It's everything you've always dreamed of." "But you'll need me, dear. How can I—" "We'll figure it out," Julia interrupted firmly. "Just as you always found a way to be there for me, even while working those long hours at the restaurant. Now it's your turn to achieve your dreams." The waiter arrived with the dishes they had ordered, and Helena noticed she had barely looked at the menu. Her stomach was a bundle of emotions from the day. As they ate, mother and daughter began to make plans. Julia could temporarily move into Helena's apartment, which was closer to the hospital. They could even hire a nurse for the times when Helena was at work. "You know, Mom," Julia said while savoring her dessert, "this baby is already teaching us something. Sometimes life doesn't go as planned, but that doesn't mean it can't work out." Helena smiled, recalling her grandmother Josefa's words. "In the kitchen, as in life, some of the best dishes emerge when we have to improvise with what we have." That afternoon, when Helena returned to the magnificent palace, she found Robert, the manager, waiting for her with a scowl. "Where have you been? We have an important event tonight." "I had to take care of a family matter," Helena replied calmly, a composure she no longer felt. For the first time, Robert's criticisms seemed less significant. There were bigger decisions to make. While preparing the kitchen for the evening service, Helena thought about how her life was about to change completely. She was going to be a grandmother. She might even have her own restaurant. So many dreams and responsibilities were mixing together like ingredients in a complex recipe. That night, as she prepared her famous shrimp bobo, Helena realized she was adding a different seasoning to every gesture. She was no longer just the chef fighting to keep her job. It was a woman on the verge of a new journey, carrying not only her own hopes, but also the future of her daughter and grandchild. Otius tea. The end of the shift, well past midnight, Helena finally closed her recipe notebook. Tomorrow she would have to give her answer to Anthony Vasconcelos. She looked at the photo of her grandmother Josefa in the notebook and whispered, "Give me strength, Grandma. Now more than ever, I need your wisdom." The morning arrived with a mixture of aromas flooding the kitchen of the magnificent palace. Helena had come even earlier than usual, preparing a special cornmeal cake with fennel, just like her grandmother used to make during life's important moments. When Anthony Vasconcelos entered the kitchen, he was greeted by the comforting scent of freshly baked cake. Helena waited for him with a cup of coffee and a plate holding a generous slice of the still steaming cake. "That reminds me of my mother's house," Anthony commented after the first bite, his eyes shining with memory. "How do you capture those memories in your dishes, Helena?" "That's exactly what I want to teach at the restaurant school," she replied firmly. "I accept your proposal, Mr. Vasconcelos, but I need to be honest about something." Helena explained Julia's high-risk pregnancy, her responsibilities as a mother and soon-to-be grandmother. She expected to see disappointment in the businessman's eyes, but found only understanding. "Do you know why I chose you, Helena?" Anthony asked as he helped himself to another slice of cake. "It wasn't just because of your exceptional cooking, it was because of your humanity. And that's exactly what I want in the restaurant school. Someone who understands that gastronomy goes beyond the pots. It's about family, about care, about love." They spent the next few hours discussing the project details. The training would start immediately, with classes in financial management, marketing, and administration. Helena could adjust her schedule to accompany Julia to her most important medical appointments. However, not everything would be smooth. When Robert discovered the new project, his face turned an intense shade of red. "So that's it? You're going to abandon the magnificent palace after all these years?" "It isn't abandonment, Robert," Helena tried to explain. "I'll serve my transition period, train whoever replaces me." "Ha! And who's going to want to learn your outdated recipes?" he mocked. "This place needs modernization, sophistication, not home-cooked food." Robert's words stung, yet something in Helena had changed. She did not shrink as she used to. "Do you know the difference between sophistication and authenticity, Robert? The former pleases the eyes, the latter touches the soul." In the weeks that followed, Helena immersed herself in her new routine. Mornings were devoted to studying, spreadsheets, cost calculations, marketing strategies. Afternoons alternated between the kitchen at the magnificent palace and Julia's consultations. Evenings were reserved for developing the menu for the new restaurant school. At home, she transformed her small apartment to accommodate Julia. The guest room became a cozy nest for her daughter, decorated with plants and family photos. In the kitchen, Helena tested new recipes while speaking to Julia's growing belly, sharing stories about her great-grandmother Josefa. The exhaustion was immense, yet Helena found energy in every small victory. When she managed to calculate the profit margin on a dish correctly for the first time, her eyes shone like those of a child. When she presented her first business plan to Anthony, her hands trembled, but her voice was steady. At the magnificent palace, tensions escalated. Robert began scrutinizing her every move, criticizing every decision, questioning every recipe. Yet the customers continued to order her dishes, especially the shrimp bobo, which had become a kind of symbol of resilience. One afternoon, while organizing the preparations for dinner service, Helena noticed something odd with the ingredients orders. Quantities were off, and key items were missing from the list. With her newfound management knowledge, she realized these weren't mere mistakes. Someone was deliberately sabotaging her work. "How long until you give up?" Robert asked with a malicious smile as he watched her rearrange the orders. "This restaurant school idea won't last. You don't have the structure for it." Helena only smiled, recalling her grandmother's words. "When someone tries to ruin your porridge, it's a sign you're doing just fine." Calmly, she redid the orders, documented the changes, and sent a detailed report to Anthony. That evening, exhausted yet satisfied, Helena sat beside Julia on the couch. Her daughter gently caressed her belly while reading a book on motherhood. "How was your day, Mom?" "Tough," Helena admitted. "But you know what? For the first time in my life, challenges don't scare me. They motivate me." The main hall of the future restaurant school still smelled of fresh paint when Helena observed the group of young chefs who would form her first class. 15. Faces looked up at her, expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. Most of them were no older than 25, all graduates of the country's and abroad's best culinary schools. "Welcome to the Flavors of Brazil project," Helena began, her voice firmer than she felt inside. 3 months had passed since she accepted Anthony's proposal, and now she faced her first major challenge as director. In the very front row, Helena noticed a young woman with a haughty expression, Carolina Mendoza, heiress to a famous family of restaurateurs from São Paulo. Next to her, Philip Torres nervously adjusted his immaculate uniform, freshly returned from an internship in Paris. "Today we'll begin with something fundamental, capixaba moqueca," Helena announced, watching. The reactions. She saw ironic smiles forming on some faces. "With all due respect," Carolina raised her hand, her tone dripping with condescension, I came here expecting to learn advanced culinary techniques. Moqueca is, well, it's beach food. Helena smiled, recalling her own insecurities from months past. Miss Mendoza, what is the ideal temperature to sear a fillet? 54 degrees Celsius for a rare finish, of course, Carolina replied promptly. And what is the ideal temperature for the palm oil to release its flavors without burning? The ensuing silence was revealing. Helena continued, Brazilian cuisine is no less technical because it's traditional. Every recipe you learn here carries centuries of knowledge passed down from generation to generation. As she organized the students at their workstations, her phone vibrated. It was a message from Julia. Mom, the pressure's risen a bit. The doctor wants to monitor you. Helena felt her heart tighten, but she took a deep breath. Now she could not let worry show. The practical class began, and Helena moved among the stations, observing each student's technique. Philip, despite his French training, showed genuine interest, asking questions about the perfect point for the moqueca. Others, like Carolina, maintained a subtle resistance, performing tasks with evident disdain. The secret is in love, Helena explained, repeating her grandmother's words as she demonstrated how to prepare the porridge to accompany the moqueca. Every dish tells a story, carries a tradition. But how are we supposed to innovate like that? Another student questioned. The market wants modern dishes with elaborate presentations. Innovation doesn't mean abandoning our roots, Helena answered, pulling out her recipe notebook. Look at this reinterpretation of bobo I developed. She paused mid-sentence as she noticed something amiss with the ingredients at her station. The shrimp were different from those she had selected that morning. A closer look confirmed her suspicion. Someone had swapped out the previously set-aside ingredients. She recognized the handiwork of Robert. Even though he had left the magnificent palace, he was still trying to sabotage her. But this time, she was ready. Change of plans, she announced calmly. Today we're going to learn about adaptation in the kitchen, because a great chef isn't someone who only works with perfect ingredients. The class turned into a lesson on creativity and problem solving. Helena demonstrated how to adjust a dish to the conditions at hand, transforming an apparent problem into a learning opportunity. At the end of class, even the most skeptical had to admit the result was exceptional. Philip was the first to speak up. I never thought Brazilian food could be so technical. Carolina, still resistant but visibly impressed, approached Helena after class. My grandmother, she made moqueca too. I never appreciated it. I always thought I needed to learn only international cuisine to be a great chef. Helena smiled, recognizing in that confession a small victory. Sometimes we need to look back in order to move forward, Carolina. After everyone had left, Helena finally allowed herself to check her phone. 3 missed calls from Julia. Her hands trembled as she dialed her daughter's number, silently praying that everything was all right. The day had been a mixture of achievements and concerns, like a dish balancing diverse flavors. As she packed her materials, Helena looked at the empty kitchen and whispered, Grandma Josefa, keep giving me strength. We still have much work ahead. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors. Helena held Julia's hand, who had finally fallen asleep after hours of tension. Julia's blood pressure had spiked dangerously during the night, forcing an emergency admission. We need to keep her under observation for at least 48 hours, explained Dr. Santos, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the tests. Preeclampsia is a condition that demands constant monitoring. Helena nodded, feeling the weight of exhaustion. She had spent the entire night at the hospital, alternating between calls to Anthony Vasconcelos to reorganize the day's classes and messages to Peter, who was on an international flight and wouldn't return for 2 days. Her phone vibrated once more. It was Carolina Mendoza. Professor, sorry to bother you, but we need to confirm the menu for next week's test event. The sponsors are putting pressure on us. Helena looked at sleeping Julia and then at the dozens of unanswered messages on her phone. How could she balance it all? The test event was crucial for the future of the restaurant school, an opportunity to showcase the project to important figures in the culinary world. "Miss Helena?" The gentle voice of the nurse brought her back to the present. "Your daughter is stable now. Why don't you go home and rest a bit? I promise to call if there's any change." At home, Helena tried to sleep, but her mind wouldn't quiet. She got up and went to the kitchen, her usual refuge. While she prepared a cup of chamomile tea, it felt as if her grandmother Josefa were whispering in her ear. In the kitchen, as in life, sometimes you have to let things rest to find just the right balance. The phone rang again. It was Anthony Vasconcelos. "Helena, I heard about Julia. How is she?" "Stable, but she'll need to stay in the hospital," Helena replied, fighting back tears. "Anthony, I don't know if I can—" "Helena," he interrupted gently, "remember what we discussed about authenticity? Sometimes that means acknowledging our limitations. I have a proposal. Why don't we turn this challenge into an opportunity?" In the days that followed, Helena completely reorganized the class dynamics. With help from Philip and, surprisingly, Carolina, she created a monitoring system where more experienced students assisted the newcomers. This allowed her to split her time between the hospital and the restaurant school. "You taught us that traditional cuisine is about community," Philip said during one of the sessions he led. "We're just putting that into practice." Even Carolina, who had initially resisted the course idea, began bringing in recipes from her own grandmother, a Spanish immigrant who had adapted her dishes to Brazilian cuisine. "I think I finally understand what you meant by every dish telling a story," she confided to Helena. At the hospital, Julia's condition fluctuated between improvement and setbacks. One particularly difficult afternoon, as Helena held her daughter's hand through another high blood pressure crisis, Julia whispered, "Mom, don't give up on the restaurant because of me. This baby needs a grandparent who makes things happen." The test event loomed, and Helena split her time between preparations and hospital visits. The students, aware of her situation, began arriving earlier and staying later to help with the preparations. Even Robert, who still tried to create obstacles from afar, seemed to have reduced his interference, perhaps realizing that the group's unity was stronger than his attempts at sabotage. One evening, while finalizing the event menu on her laptop, beside Julia's bedside, Helena had an epiphany. The true seasoning of a dish wasn't only in its ingredients, but in the stories and people behind it. Every challenge she faced, every adaptation she had to make, every moment of doubt and triumph, it was all coming together into a unique recipe. "What are you writing, Mom?" Julia asked, waking from a nap. "The menu for the event," Helena replied, showing her the screen. "But I think I'm writing so much more than that. I'm writing our story." Before dawn, Helena arrived at the restaurant school on that decisive morning. The test event was set to begin in 12 hours, and every detail had to be perfect. 50 of the country's most important critics and culinary influencers would be present not only to evaluate the food, but to assess the entire concept. "Good morning, Professor." Philip surprised her, already in uniform and organizing the mise en place. Beside him, Carolina was supervising other students who had arrived early to help. The group that had once resisted her classes now formed a united, dedicated team. "The appetizers are ready, the main courses are on the stove, and I just double-checked every ingredient," Carolina informed her as she consulted her clipboard. A remarkable change had come over her since she started sharing her grandmother's recipes with the class. Helena smiled, moved by the dedication of her students, when her phone vibrated. It was a message from the night shift nurse. "Julia had a quiet night. Blood pressure is stable." She breathed a sigh of relief. Her daughter was being closely monitored at the hospital, and Peter had finally managed to get a break to be with her. Soon the kitchen came alive with the sounds of knives chopping, pots bubbling, and instructions being exchanged. The event menu had been carefully planned to tell a story through flavors. Each dish represented a different region of Brazil, a memory, a tradition. "Professor," called Philip, "there's something wrong with the main oven." Helena approached and noticed that the temperature was off. Examining the equipment, she found signs of tampering. Yet another sabotage attempt by Robert. Don't worry, Helena remained calm. Remember what we learned about adaptation. We'll rearrange the preparation schedule and use the auxiliary ovens. Her years of dealing with Robert's schemes were now transforming into a valuable lesson for her students. As the afternoon wore on, the tension mounted. Helena alternated between supervising the preparations and checking messages from Peter about Julia's condition. Every dish that left the kitchen carried not only flavors, but also the personal stories of the students. Carolina had suggested including on the menu a reinterpretation of a dish from her grandmother, blending European techniques with Brazilian ingredients. Philip contributed with a dessert that merged his experiences in France with traditional sweets from the countryside of Minas Gerais. At 7 p.m., the first guests began to arrive. From the kitchen, Helena watched as Anthony Vasconcelos greeted them in the dining room. She noticed he looked tense, concerned about something beyond the event. The first order is already at table 3, Carolina announced. It's for Rodrigo Andrade's table, the critic from Flavors and Aromas. The kitchen fell into a frenetic yet controlled rhythm. Every dish that emerged was a small masterpiece, telling a piece of Brazil's story. The aroma of shrimp bobo blended with the scent of herbed lamb from the backcountry, while the capixaba moqueca perfumed the air with its characteristic spices. Comments began to flow in. Extraordinary. A true revolution in Brazilian cuisine. Technically impeccable, emotionally stirring. Helena's heart raced with every compliment, yet something in Anthony's expression troubled her. Mid-service, her phone rang. It was Peter. Helena, don't worry, everything's under control, but Julia's blood pressure has spiked a bit. The doctor is already on it. Helena felt her legs weaken, torn between her duty in the kitchen and her maternal instinct. Sensing her distress, Carolina approached. Professor, please go to the hospital. We've got it from here. I can't leave you all now. Fayu taught us well, Philip interjected. Besides, there's no recipe more important than family. At that moment, Anthony entered the kitchen. His face was pale, and he motioned for Helena to speak with him privately. She looked around at her students at the packed dining room, at her phone with the hospital message. Helena, Anthony began in a low, tense voice, we need to talk. It's about the future of the project. The aroma of the dishes still enveloped the kitchen, but now it carried a new tension. Helena sensed that she was about to face yet another challenge, perhaps the greatest of them all. As her grandmother used to say, in the kitchen, as in life, sometimes the most difficult ingredients are the ones that give the dish its richest flavor. The small back room of the restaurant seemed even smaller with the tension hanging. In the air, Anthony Vasconcelos ran his hand through his graying hair, a gesture Helena had never seen from her usually composed boss. The investments in Asia went wrong, he began, his voice laden with sorrow. I lost more money than I can admit publicly. The bank is pressuring me and... He paused as if the next words were physically painful to say. I'll have to sell some assets. The restaurant school is on the list. Helena felt as though the ground had vanished beneath her feet. Outside, the clatter of cutlery and lively conversations seemed to belong to another world. Her phone vibrated again, a new message from the hospital, but she barely registered it. How much time do we have? She asked, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. 30 days at most. There's already an interested buyer, a major international restaurant chain. Anthony's voice carried the weight of many years. They have no interest in the school concept. They want to turn it into another luxury restaurant. Helena closed her eyes for a moment, recalling all the people who depended on this project. Her students who had finally found purpose in their profession, the small local producers supplying ingredients, the families who would benefit from the social program we planned to implement. There must be an alternative, she murmured more to herself than to Anthony. At that moment, Carolina knocked on the door. Professor, sorry to interrupt, but critic Rodrigo Andrade is asking to meet the chef, and there are 3 more journalists wanting interviews. Helena looked at Anthony, who gave a slight nod. Go, this is your night, despite everything. Back in the dining room, Helena was greeted with applause. Critic Rodrigo Andrade, known for his sharp tongue and ruthless reviews, stood holding a wine glass. "Chef Helena," he began, "in my 20 years writing about cuisine, I've rarely tasted dishes that told such truthful stories. Every flavor here isn't just food, it's memory, it's culture, it's Brazil." While receiving compliments and answering questions from the journalists, Helena's mind raced. Years of managing a tight-budget kitchen had taught her to think in creative solutions. Her phone vibrated once more, this time a message from Philip. "Professor, you need to see this. The comments on social media are exploding. Everyone is talking about the restaurant." Helena excused herself and returned to the kitchen, where her students had transformed one of the screens into a live comments wall. People from all over the country were sharing their own family food stories, traditional recipes and culinary memories. "That's it," she whispered, an idea beginning to form. Carolina approached, still coordinating the final orders of the evening. "Professor, is something wrong?" Helena looked at her team, the young faces she had come to love like family. "Gather everyone after service," she said. "I have a proposal." Later, when the last customer had left and the kitchen was cleaned, Helena convened her students. She explained the financial situation, the possible sale, the end of the project. Then her eyes sparkled with that familiar light, the same that shone when she was about to teach a particularly challenging recipe. "But what if," she began, "we transformed this into something new? Something of our own?" The idea was bold, to turn the restaurant school into a cooperative. Each student would become a partner, contributing not only with their work, but with their own family recipes and stories. They would create a business model that preserved the project's essence, while making it financially viable. "It's risky," Philip pondered. "Just like every good recipe on its first try," Helena replied with a smile. Carolina was the first to step forward. "I'm in, and I can bring in some minor investors through my family contacts." One by one, the students began to offer their skills and resources. One knew digital marketing, another had experience in financial management, while yet another had contacts among small rural producers. When Helena finally returned to the hospital that night, she found Julia awake, her face lit by the soft glow of a bedside lamp. "How was the event, Mom?" Helena took her daughter's hand, feeling the baby move beneath her palm. "It was transformative," she replied, realizing that the word carried more meaning than she had ever imagined. The makeshift meeting room in the restaurant's kitchen was packed. Helena watched proudly as her students presented their ideas for the cooperative. The whiteboard was covered in notes, spreadsheets, and colorful post-its, each representing a part of the ambitious plan they had developed over the past 2 weeks. "The numbers are promising," explained Philip, pointing to a financial projection. "With the cooperative model, we can reduce operating costs by 30%. Every partner contributes not only with labor, but with a small initial investment." Carolina, who had surprisingly become one of the project's biggest advocates, added, "I've already secured 5 minor investors willing to support us. They believe in the concept of preserving traditional Brazilian cuisine." The plan was audacious, to transform the restaurant school into a gastronomic cooperative, where each member would contribute their own family recipes and stories. Classes would continue, but now in a new format that included public workshops and mentorship programs for traditional cooks. "But we still need more capital," one student warned. "Even with Carolina's investors, there's a significant shortfall." Helena took a deep breath before making the announcement she had planned. "I will put my life savings into the project, the money I have been saving all these years to open my own restaurant." A respectful silence filled the room. Everyone knew how much that money meant to Helena. It was decades of a dream reduced to numbers in a bank account. "We can't accept that," protested Philip. "You need that money, especially now with your grandchild on the way." Helena smiled, taking her inseparable recipe notebook. "You know what my grandmother Josefa always said? The true treasure is not what we keep, but what we share. This project is bigger than my individual dream. It's our collective dream." At that moment, Robert, the former manager of the magnificent palace, burst through the kitchen door. His face was red and he clutched a tablet. "So it's true," he exclaimed. "You really think you can turn this into a cooperative? Have you seen what's being said on social media?" Helena took the tablet. On the screen, several posts questioned the ability of a mere cook without formal training to lead such a grand culinary project. Some messages, clearly planted, insinuated that the restaurant school had already failed due to poor management. "What do you get out of this, Robert?" Helena asked, keeping her composure. "Reality," he shot back. "You're living in a fantasy. Do you really think anyone will take seriously a restaurant run by an uncredentialed cook and a bunch of rebellious students?" Carolina stepped forward, her elegant posture contrasting sharply with Robert's fury. "Do you know the difference between having a degree and having wisdom, Robert? A degree is hung on a wall, wisdom is served on a plate." The other students gathered around, forming a protective circle around Helena. Robert looked around, realizing he was alone in his crusade. "You'll regret this," he threatened before storming out. "This project won't last 3 months." After his departure, Helena realized her hands were trembling, not from fear, but from emotion at seeing how united her students had become. Each of them had grown so much in the past weeks, not only as professionals but as people. "Well," she said, returning to the planning board, "I think we've just added another challenge to overcome." The group resumed work with renewed energy. While discussing digital marketing strategies and partnerships with local producers, Helena received a message from Peter. "Julia is asking for you. Her blood pressure is still unstable." Helena looked at her students, now completely absorbed in their tasks, each contributing their unique skills to the project. She realized she had created far more than just a restaurant. She had built a family. "Professor," Philip called, "we found a solution for the organic supply issue." Helena smiled, tucking away her phone. Her daughter was in good hands with Peter, and she was sure Julia would understand her dedication to the project. After all, she was building a legacy not only for her grandchild, but for everyone who believed in the transformative power of cuisine. "Tell me more about this solution," she requested, opening her recipe notebook. It was time to create not only new dishes, but a new future. The hospital corridor seemed endless as Helena rushed, still in her chef's uniform. An urgent call from Peter had interrupted an important investors' meeting. "Come now, Julia needs you." When she reached the room, she found her daughter surrounded by doctors. The heart monitor was beeping alarmingly, and Julia's face was as pale as paper. "Her blood pressure is too high," explained Dr. Santos. "We need to perform an emergency cesarean." Helena felt her legs buckle. It was too soon. The baby was only 32 weeks. Peter held her hand, his face marked by worry. "Mom," Julia called weakly, "promise you'll be here when I wake." "Always, my dear," Helena replied, kissing her forehead. "Always." While Julia was prepped for surgery, Helena found herself alone in the waiting room. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages from students about the investors' meeting, questions about the day's menu, issues with suppliers. But none of that mattered now. Carolina was the first to arrive at the hospital, followed by Philip and other students. They had left the restaurant in the hands of the more experienced to support their mentor. "The investors understood perfectly," Carolina assured. "Family comes first. You taught us that." The hours dragged on. Helena paced the corridor, occasionally sitting with her head in her hands, murmuring old prayers her grandmother Josepha had taught her. Philip approached with a small thermal pot. "I brought that vegetable broth you always make when someone isn't feeling well." The familiar aroma of saffron-infused vegetable broth, a recipe Helena had inherited from her grandmother, brought a little comfort to the tense moment. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Santos appeared with a tired smile. "They are fighters," he announced. "Mother and daughter are fine. The baby is small, will need to stay in the neonatal ICU for a few weeks, but he's strong." Helena's tears flowed freely as her students embraced her. Peter emerged from the recovery room, his eyes misty. "It's a boy. Julia wants you to choose his name, Helena." When she was finally allowed to see her daughter, Helena found Julia awake, though exhausted. "I was thinking of calling him Jose," Julia whispered, "after his great-grandfather." Helena smiled through her tears. Jose had been the husband of her grandmother Josefa, a fisherman who knew all the secrets of the sea and its tides. "It's perfect," she replied. Through the window of the neonatal ICU, Helena watched her grandson, so tiny, yet fighting bravely for his life. She remembered her grandmother's words. Life is like a strong spice. It may make you cry, but it gives flavor to our story. Back in her room, she found her students organizing a shift schedule to help in the coming days. Carolina had created a spreadsheet with times for visits and assistance at the restaurant. Philip coordinated with others to reorganize the week's workshops. We are a family now, Carolina said, surprising Helena with an embrace. And families take care of each other. Peter, who would have to return to work in a few days, looked visibly relieved by the support. I don't know how to thank you all, he said to the students. Thank them by keeping the project alive, Philip replied, because now it's no longer just a restaurant or a school. It's the legacy little Joseph will inherit. Helena watched the scene with a heart overflowing with emotion. Amid the tension and fear of the past hours, something beautiful had blossomed, the certainty that she was not alone. Every person in that room was a special ingredient in the recipe of her life. Her phone vibrated once more. It was a message from Anthony Vasconcelos. I heard about your grandson. Congratulations. And don't worry about the restaurant deadline. Some things are more important than business. Helena smiled, putting her phone aside. Through the hospital window, she could see the sun rising over São Paulo, painting the sky in hopeful hues. Her grandson had chosen a difficult moment to come into the world, but perhaps that was exactly what everyone needed. A reminder that life, like the best recipe, always finds a way to surprise. Little Joseph celebrated his first month on the same day that the final deadline for the restaurant sale approached. Helena watched her grandson through the neonatal ICU glass. He was growing stronger each day, just like the cooperative project that had become her second family. Some investors confirmed their participation early this morning, Carolina announced as she quietly entered the ICU. Her high heels had been replaced by comfortable shoes, and her designer clothes gave way to the simple uniform of the cooperative. We did it, Professor. We reached our investment goal. Helena's eyes filled with tears. Over the past few weeks, as she divided her time between the hospital and the restaurant, she had witnessed an extraordinary transformation in her students. Each one had become a cornerstone of the project. Philip managed the kitchen with the same technical precision he'd honed in France, but now his dishes told Brazilian stories. One of his recent successes was a reinterpretation of the shrimp. Bobo Helena had taught him, presented in a contemporary style while preserving the soul of the original dish. In administration, Carolina had surprised everyone with her leadership and sensitivity. She had created a mentorship program where seasoned traditional chefs were invited to share their knowledge with the students. Robert showed up at the restaurant today, Carolina mentioned hesitantly. Helena looked away from Joseph. What did he want? He offered a partnership in a new venture of his. He said he recognizes he was wrong and that our social media success proves the concept works. Carolina paused. I politely sent him away. Helena smiled, recalling how much Carolina had changed since her early days in the course, when she shared the same elitist view as Robert regarding traditional cuisine. A nurse approached with good news. If Joseph continued progressing at this pace, he might go home next week. Helena's heart warmed. Her grandson was a fighter, just like everyone in her family. Back at the restaurant, Helena found a surprise. Her students had transformed the main dining room into a space for a special event. On the walls, old photos, mingled with new ones, traditional recipes displayed alongside their contemporary reinterpretations, faces of grandmothers next to their grandchildren, all united by a shared passion for cuisine. It's our tribute to you, explained Philip, and to everyone who came before us. In the center of the room, a special table had been set. On it were dishes that recounted the restaurant's history, the shrimp bobo that started it all, the moqueca that united the first class, and various reinterpretations of traditional recipes created by the students. Anthony Vasconcelos, who had been invited to the event, watched everything with misty eyes. You know, Helena, he commented, when I bought this place, I thought I was just acquiring another restaurant. I never imagined I was planting such a special seed. Helena opened her now even thicker recipe notebook, with contributions from her students. Between the time-yellowed pages, new sheets had been added, each telling a different story, each part of a legacy in the making. "Professor," a young student called, "could you tell us once again the story of the first bobo you made?" Helena smiled and sat down at the table surrounded by her students. It was like this now. Each recipe, a story, each story, a lesson, each lesson a step in building something greater than all of them. The aroma wafting from the kitchen was a symphony of Brazilian spices. In the neonatal ICU, Joseph grew stronger with every day. In her recipe notebook, new stories mingled with ancient traditions. And in Helena's heart, there was the certainty that some dreams need time to take the right shape, just like a good stew that must simmer slowly to reach its perfect flavor. The morning sun illuminated the new sign on the restaurant's facade. Flavors and Memories, Gastronomic Cooperative. It was the official reopening day, 3 months after Joseph's birth, as he now slept peacefully in Julia's arms, seated in the front row of the packed hall. Helena adjusted her chef's uniform in the office mirror, noting the small changes time had brought. Her hair was a bit grayer, but her eyes shone with renewed energy. In the pocket of her uniform, as always, was her inseparable recipe notebook. "It's time, Professor," Carolina called softly. Now the administrative director of the cooperative, she had found her true calling in preserving and celebrating traditional cuisine. The hall was filled with familiar and new faces. In the very front row, besides Julia and Joseph, was Peter, who had managed to transfer to regional flights to stay closer to family. Anthony Vasconcelos smiled proudly, no longer as an owner but as a mentor and friend. Philip, who ran the kitchen alongside Helena, had prepared a special menu for the occasion. Every dish represented a step in the journey that had brought them here. The shrimp bobo that started it all, the moqueca that united the first class, and several reinterpretations of traditional recipes created by the students. "Welcome to Flavors and Memories," Helena began her speech, her voice firm and emotional. "This place is more than just a restaurant. It's a space where stories are told through flavors, where tradition and innovation walk hand in hand, where every dish is a celebration of our culture." As she spoke, Helena surveyed the audience. She saw the local producers who had become essential partners in the project. She recognized traditional chefs from different regions of Brazil who were now part of the mentorship program. She even noticed Robert, seated discreetly at the back, his expression a mix of remorse and admiration. "When I started in this profession 25 years ago, I had a simple dream, to have my own restaurant. Today I realize that the universe had bigger plans. We didn't just build a restaurant. We built a family, a center for cultural preservation, a space for transformation." Little Joseph let out a small gurgle, drawing smiles from the crowd. Helena lifted her grandson in her arms, continuing her speech with the baby. A perfect image of the union between tradition and future that the project embodied. "This little one," she smiled, adjusting Joseph, "was born with our cooperative. And like him, we are just beginning our journey. From today on, in addition to the restaurant and school, we will launch our program for research and documentation of traditional Brazilian cuisine." Carolina took the floor, explaining how the project would expand to other regions of the country, creating a network for the preservation and innovation of culinary arts. Philip presented an exchange program that would allow young chefs to learn from traditional cooks in different communities. After the speeches, as guests savored the special menu, Helena allowed herself a moment of reflection. She opened her recipe notebook to the last page, where she had pasted an old photo of her grandmother Josefa next to a recent photo of Joseph. "The aroma is wonderful," Julia commented as she approached. Grandma Josefa would be so proud. Helena embraced her daughter, looking at the lively hall. In the kitchen, she could hear the familiar sound of clattering pans and lively discussions, now mixed with laughter and animated debates about recipes and techniques. The aroma in the air was the perfect blend of tradition and innovation. "You know, dear," Helena said softly, "your grandmother always said the best recipe is the one made with love and shared with others. I think I finally understand what she meant." Joseph stirred in his mother's arms, his little eyes absorbing the bustling movement around him. He was too young to understand, but one day he would know that his arrival had coincided with something truly special. a place where the past and future met in the present, where every dish told a story, and where the true flavor of success wasn't only in the ingredients, but in the love and dedication with which they were prepared. Helena closed her recipe notebook, a volume that was no longer merely a book of culinary instructions, but a living record of dreams, struggles, and triumphs. In the kitchen, a new class of students began to arrive for the night shift. Work continued, stories multiplied, and the future, like a well-crafted recipe, promised new and delicious flavors.